we tell people to call in and give their prayer requests. And some of you, some of you who are taking these requests, the ones that are calling in, you don't have to wonder if the spiritual warfare that is preached is real or not. You tell me, how could a husband or a wife get so divided? This has gone on for years, not just in the last few years, but for years and years. How could a husband and wife get so divided over the husband or wife's commitment to this ministry? And you tell me that Satan is not at work? But you'll find that people who are fighting about this ministry, behind it all, you've either got a spouse that thinks the smiling cantaloupe head idiocy out there, that's Christianity, that's the real stuff. Think positive, it'll be okay. Quit talking about all this spiritual warfare. Don't educate us. Keep us in the mind frame of finding a bottle to suck on. Don't teach. Don't even assume for a minute that the people listening desire to be taught or enriched or enlightened with something more. There's one half there, or the other half is you just have something absolutely against any ministry. This one becomes the absolute target, but they haven't even sat for an hour to listen to what's going on the network. Or if they've sat for an hour, it's been with the ears plugged. You won't get me. I don't want you. You won't convert me. I don't want to convert you. Well, you won't get me to send my money. I don't want your money. And maybe if you listen long enough, you might figure out what it is that God's trying to get out of you. That should be illuminating right there. All of this crazy professing allegiance to a person. I can't save you. In fact, if you hung out with me a little while, I'd probably take you to hell. I've been to Texas a few times. Y'all take care now. I'm reading. This is a king's house. Spouse cannot stand the commitment to this ministry. But I know this is not just one, this is many. What does Pastor Scott do? Pastor Scott comes in and delivers an hour and a half. We have a service at 11. We're done by 12:30 or 1:45. We have festivals of teaching. I've come in and Dr. Scott teaches. We play communion. You see any appeals for junk or stuff, selling you, merchandising you? These are the things I can never connect with. A spouse hates this ministry. You can only deduce one thing. They hate it because of what it represents. They don't. No, if we were selling things and merchandising, the same person would probably have no problem with it. It's what's being represented, or what, better yet, is being presented. The gospel. Now, I don't want to come into your house and bring more division. That's not my responsibility. If you've committed your way to the Lord, then you should also commit the problems with your spouse to the Lord as well. Now, Dr. Scott used to say a good divorce is better than a bad marriage. I say, when you start out, the starting point should be that you understand where you're both going, what direction you're headed in. I know some people don't always make that clear at the beginning. You know, it's the hormones and the pheromones and everything else that starts off with wow, this is really great, until you get, you know, a couple of years in, you go, wow, this is terrible. Isn't that amazing? The same eyes that looked on something at the beginning, and then you look again, you go, what is that? What type of a monster is that? I have a little bit different mindset. Just a little bit different. I believe if you bought it, you own it. You better ask God to fix it. Because nothing's perfect. You know, you could say, you begin to pray for your spouse, and nothing's happened, and you've been praying for 5 years and 10 years. Now keep praying. Keep asking God. You never know what God will do. If you have committed your way and rolled it off on Him, you don't know what God will do. God may be preparing the soil of that person's heart for a set time that you know nothing about. Don't stop praying. You'd be surprised what can wreak havoc in our mind, in our heart, with what goes on just in our household. I referenced a mother not being able to console or bring comfort to her child. And I don't know, because I'm not a natural mother, but I can only imagine what that must be like, to have a child that you cannot help. No words ever bring enough comfort or understanding, no connectivity. And it seems like there's no possibility, but don't stop praying. And that's why I tell you, also call in. I'm not going to stop praying either. Keep calling in. And sometimes I'll even ask the people to pray with me. And you who take the phone call, you don't have to tell the person on the other end that you're praying, but you took their request. You can quietly in your own time, you can take that to your own prayer. And believe God that God will do what we can't. But, you know, what I'm trying to say is it's a spiritual battle. Now, some of you have been around long enough to know it, and there's others just coming and recognizing, wow, this spiritual warfare stuff really is true. Yes. And that's why you cannot make the trip without putting on the whole armor of God. You keep the whole armor on. Don't forget one piece. Don't think, well, I don't need that today. I've got these things and I don't need that. And if you need help, take that Ephesians 6 and photocopy it and put it everywhere that you can look in a mirror, open a drawer. Some might think you're a lunatic. To remind you of the fact, until second nature in your framework, you know you're a target, you know you're going to be lobbed at, sought after, that you, everywhere you look, you've got something that reminds you of the warfare you're in, if you need that. Now, some of us don't. Some of us don't need reminding. We just look around and we know it by what we see. And if you know that you're in a battle, but you forget what exactly you need to do, then I suggest you find the promises that fit exactly what you're going through and put those around, whether it's, you know, you might say, wow, that's crazy, but you know there are people who have a time of day. It seems like at that time of day, everything starts going downhill. Could be after work. Could be in the morning. You know when those times are. You find the places that these things tend to occur, and you make sure that you've got fresh reminders of Scripture. Maybe it's in your car on the way to work. Then get a DVD. Quit listening to the news. Put on something that's edifying, and if you don't need that, then commit something to memory that on your way to work will help you to stave off and to ward off that which is coming at you, because you know what it is. You may not know it in the totality, but at least in part. You equip yourself. This is where I know I'm most vulnerable. Now, this is part of the trip. If you don't like that, good luck, friends. And if not, if you do like me, I'm trying to find ways that are the reminders that at least remind you in the moment that your faith grip and your eyesight begins to just ever so slightly from Christ to the problem or from Christ to the attack, that you be put in check again and afresh you remind yourself, I have weaponry, I have a covering, I have tools. Now, it's not going to be won in a minute or an hour, but the battle is won the minute you say, I know the wiles, I know the methods, I know the schemes of the devil and the tactics he uses. He's pretty crafty, but he always comes back to the same one, seemingly. Wisen up. I know where the attack is. I know who the attacker is. The whole armor of God is on. The promises are around me, or I find places to put them, or they're in my mind, and I know them. Now, don't say, I won't be attacked. Say, I'm armed and equipped for battle. Oh, all right. Get on the telephone.
The phone number to call is 1-800-338-3030. That's 1-800-338-3030. Pastor Scott's website address is PastorMelissaScott.com. Again, PastorMelissaScott.com. To make your reservations for this Sunday service, call 1-800-338-3030. That's 1-800-338-3030. You are watching the University Network. The phone number to call is 1-800-338-3030. That's 1-800-338-3030.
Giving is not some add-on to the Christian faith. And you that are tired of carrying the load by yourself, You better let me talk about this subject to get some of those that aren't carrying enough load yet oriented. Antichrist is very much a reality in the world to come. When Paul was on this earth, he said the spirit of Antichrist was working in his day. But he wrote to the Thessalonians that that spirit of Antichrist, already at work, would find crystallized expression, incarnation, personification in what he calls the man of sin. The book of Revelations calls him the beast. Genuine, personal, living, earthly ruler who will come on the scene, be given, he won't have to seize them, be given at the outset reins of government. He comes as the answer. But he will be given reins of government, and the power that he will express will be government power, earthly authority over man. Now, to 9 out of 10 listeners, in the sound of my voice, you use the word Antichrist and they think they've been insulted. They should be, because they know the end result. But the word itself is not an epithet. Christ means deliverer, and the root meaning of the word is substitute deliverer. One who comes on the scene and becomes a substitute to deliver man from his problems, other than the true deliverer, the Christ. He cannot come to power, the Scripture says, without a false prophet who will work miracles in front of him and use religious power. The working of miracles and spiritual authority to help deceive the very elect into accepting a substitute deliverer in a marriage with government that God's Word characterizes by naming that established church that listens to the false prophet and bows down in submission to what ultimately is called the beast, but who comes in first as the substitute deliverer. That marriage of the church with the earthly ruler government. He designates the church and the portion of it that does that, the harlot woman of the book of Revelations. Now, Antichrist is a reality. The spirit of Antichrist is already at work in the land. Paul admonishes the church to look up when they see these things coming to pass, because their redemption draweth nigh. But he also gives a surety. That man of sin cannot come to power, cannot be revealed until a restraining force is removed. I happen to believe that restraining force is the church. A matter of logical deduction leads me to that. Because the Spirit will still work after Antichrist comes to power in the person of the two final prophets. But the church is pretty much divided, whether it's the Holy Spirit or the church that is the restraining force. In either case, I'm going up when that restraining force is removed, be it the church or the Holy Spirit that germinates the church with God's power and life. Antichrist can't come to power until the church is removed. A mission of the church is to resist and restrain his coming to power. That's why the church can never really marry government. That's why God, in His wisdom, literally fulfilled Romans 13. The powers that be are ordained of God when He established this constitutional government. A social contract where the governed and the governors are under the same power. and gave the wisdom to separate church and state, that gave the maneuverability of a free church to resist the encroachment of government. We happen to be in the battleground that will determine whether this is the last moment. Because as goes California, goes the United States, and as goes the United States, goes the world on this subject. Being fought out in California is the issue of whether or not Antichrist can be restrained a little longer. Overpopulated in California are false prophets trying to get the elect to bow down to government and suggesting that the only answer to the problems of religion, the only way to curb proliferation of cults, the established church is saying, and I happen to be part of the establishment in that sense, that we're a historic church and not a cult figure. The rest of the establishment church is saying the only way is to give supervision to government. The Antichrist in California wouldn't have a prayer if the church would do her job. But it's the established church, so eager to see cults get it in the neck, that they're giving away the separation and literally bowing down and recommending to their followers that government be given the supervision over churches. We're one of the few free voices left. We've been saying, or still saying, we'll keep on saying, no, we won't show. People say, if you have nothing to hide, why don't you show? Because we have nothing to hide, we can get away with our stance. And the government agencies we've whipped off of our territory know that, which is why they've backed off. They got to find a pigeon that looks a little more guilty to work their precedents on. They know it'll be like the Roman emperor that believed the rumor that the Jews were worshiping an ass's head behind the curtain in the temple, where the Holy of Holies was shielded from the eyes of men. Believing the lie told by the enemies of the Jewish faith that they kept that curtain closed because they worshipped an ass's head. He had to look in. I read to you one night the history of that man who looked. He had nothing but successes as he rose through the Roman Empire. He had nothing but failure and defeat. And as I've said, the only ass's head in there was his when he looked. There is principle that we fight for here. Now, I have talked night after night separating the audience, and have given a cop-out excuse to a lot of people who watch, because they're eager to hear me say, if you do not hear what we teach and listen long enough to make your decisions of giving with knowledge, you shouldn't be giving. But there is a point where you need to fish or cut bait. There are a lot of people that have watched long enough to know that there is a battle being fought here on live television in California on which the whole future of the church rests.
The phone number to call is 1-800-338-3030. That's 1-800-338-3030.
No matter what my friends may say, when dark trials come my way, I lift up my head and say, I'll go with Jesus all the way. I'll go with Jesus all the way.
Address all correspondence to Pastor Scott, 1615 South Glendale Avenue, Glendale, California, 91205, USA. Once again, that's Pastor Scott, 1615 South Glendale Avenue, Glendale, California, 91205, United States of America.
In the time of trouble, I know he won't ever let me down. When dark trials come my way, I lift up my head and say, I'll go with Jesus all the way, all the way.
To make your reservations for this Sunday service, call 1-800-338-3030. That's 1-800-338-3030.
When dark trials come my way, I lift up my head and say, I'll go with Jesus.
What do two Presbyterian Scottish women and an elderly Jewish man have in common? It's not a joke. History. Maybe one of the most fascinating stories that's the lesser told in the history of Jewish culture and people. Most people know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the find of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Even people who are not biblical scholars, just average folks out there, they know about that discovery. Just a haphazard discovery, just like that in the desert, and that became the greatest find, especially for our modern times. But I don't want to abase the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're extremely important, but the Dead Sea Scrolls had to do with a limited community of people, a limited community of people living in a limited area, in a limited time. Now, most people are concurrent with this idea that the Dead Sea Scrolls indeed were placed where they were placed as a burial. It's not a common practice for us in this day and age, as we live in the age of shredding. But back then there was a high reverence for the things of God, especially if God's name was on any piece of paper at any point. It was still considered sacred, and therefore it was never to be destroyed. It was to be buried, much like a human is buried, it is to be buried. These Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, were put in containers, and they were put into a cave, and they were buried, and I'm sure they were never intended to be uncovered again. So in the realm of what has changed our understanding of ancient manuscripts and history, the Dead Sea Scrolls helped us to confirm many things that previously we didn't know. We'll say pre-1950s, it's 48, but we didn't have confirmation. So the Dead Sea Scrolls provided that. But there's another find that occurred at a much earlier time in history that is less known, and perhaps in some respects important on a different level. You've heard me reference the Cairo Geniza before. In fact, it was actually referred, for the first time that I spoke to you about it, was actually referred to you in humor as a joke. Because as we were cleaning out the building here, and it seems like we spent at least 10 or 15 years, I did at least with some of the staff people, cleaning out what we then labeled Geniza rooms, which were rooms that previous staff people from many years gone by decided that they would store things. They wouldn't shred them and they wouldn't throw them out, they just stored them. Which I know if I've been a terrible person all of my life, there will be special rewards and forgiveness for me just for that one act of having endured for 15 years cleaning up the mess that was made before me for so many years gone by. I know that, so I'm very grateful. It takes a very special person to go and clean up, and it was. I don't know who's here that was with me, but there's bound to be at least one or two staff people that survived that are still here. So the term Geniza became quite common in my vocabulary to refer to the rooms in this building, perhaps, where you'd open the door and it was like a time capsule. You know, this was so-and-so's office from like 1967 to 1974. The file cabinets are all the same. The dust is still the same. Just a time capsule. So you can imagine when I started researching about the Cairo Geniza. And the importance of the Cairo Geniza, and what is the Cairo Geniza, first of all? The Cairo Geniza, there are many Genizas, but this particular Geniza happens to be in a synagogue. And most synagogues, especially in a certain time in construction, were constructed to separate men and women, to keep people separated within the synagogue. There would always be an upper level and then a smaller upper room. In this particular synagogue, the way this was done, there was a smaller upper room, and this became the room where, from the region of where this particular place is, which is called the Cairo Geniza, but Fustat was a very bustling time, a bustling place in history where it was the epicenter of trading and just very vibrant, not of one community like the Essenes or so forth. This was a dynamic place of trade. So you can imagine what happened over time when not just religious manuscripts, Torahs or things, but over the course of time, this upper room in the synagogue began to be a place of storage for every kind of document. We'll say that the synagogue dates back to perhaps somewhere in the 820s, 825, somewhere around there. So that time period begins to accumulate in this upper room things that were not wanted anymore. They were just marriage contracts, instruction for children, a parcel of land that was bought. And all these are being stored and stored and stored and then sealed up. Now, there's an interesting story behind the discovery of this Geniza, which is where these two women, two Scottish descent Presbyterian women, and a Jewish scholar, everything comes together and merges. I'm going to read briefly from a book which I think is probably one of the better books. When I say better, it's well written, it's an easy read, it kind of lures you in if you're interested in the history part of what's happened here, which it is historical. This is not fabricated. But if you were to step away from the story momentarily, it has a little bit of Alice in Wonderland, kind of falling into another world. At first, I think there were some people that tried to get into the Geniza, and they were discouraged. They were told if they opened this place, which was considered a place of burial for manuscripts and paper and so forth, that a curse would be upon them. But there began a race in probably 3 or 4 dimensions among scholars to acquire these things and to get them out of the Geniza. And the race begins with these two ladies. So I'm going to read briefly out of this Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole's Sacred Trash, The Lost and Found World of the Cairo Geniza. And if I can have the cameraman take a good picture of, push in real tight of the cover. It gives you a little idea. That's not the Geniza, by the way. That's all the papyries that came, all the things that came out. That is not the Geniza room itself, I assure you. All right, so that gives you a little idea of all the stuff. I'm just going to read a little bit. This is a next book publication, I think it is. When the self-taught Scottish scholar of Arabic and Syriac, Agnes Lewis, and her no less than learned twin sister, Margaret Gibson, hurried down a street or a hallway, they moved, as a friend later described, like ships in full sail. Their plump frames, thick lips, and slightly hawkish eyes made them theoretically identical. Both were rather vain about their dainty hands, and on special occasions they weighed down with antique rings. In a poignant and peculiar coincidence, each of the sisters had been widowed just a few years after happy marriages with clergymen. It's interesting. Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson, and it's funny, if you think that the Brangelina molding of names is unique to this generation. They did it with these two sisters, by the way, long before then. Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson were distinct to those who knew them. Older by an entire 20 minutes, Agnes was the more ambitious, colorful, domineering of the two. Margaret had a quieter intelligence, and it was said of her she was more normal, whatever that means. By age 50, this is what is staggering. By the way, this would be somewhere in the late 1800s. By age 50, Agnes had written 3 travel books, 3 novels, had translated a tourist guide from the Greek. Margaret had contributed amply to and probably helped write her sister's nonfiction books, edited her husband's translations of Cervantes' Journey to Parnassus, and grown adept at watercolors. They were, meanwhile, exceptionally close. Around Cambridge, they came to be known as a single unit, the Gibloos. That is a combination of Lewis and Gibson. There are some things that are not so modern after all. After the deaths of their husbands, they devoted themselves and their sizable inheritance to a life of travel and study together. This is what's interesting. It gives the history of how they picked up languages. It says that these women traveled and they began to acquire manuscripts. It's very interesting. It says, by their middle age, they had learned between them some 9 languages, adding to their European repertoire of Hebrew, Persian, Syriac, written in a Strangelo script. Also, having studied the latest photographic techniques, they journeyed extensively throughout the East, taking thousands of pictures of ancient manuscript pages and buying piles of others, most interesting of which they set out to transcribe and translate. So it's very fascinating to hear about these women. And there's some apocryphal stories about these women. It says, as women and as devout, not to mention eccentric and notoriously party-throwing Presbyterians, they lived and worked on the margins of mostly Anglican, male-centered Cambridge society. Women were not granted degrees in the town's illustrious university until 1948. They counted as their closest friends a whole host of Quakers, freethinkers, and Jews. Yet Agnes's 1892 discovery at St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, one of the oldest Syriac versions of the New Testament, had brought the sisters respect in learned circles, which is not part of the Cairo Geniza discoveries. 2 separate things going on here. Okay, so there's all kinds of things that they write, but there's something here that's very, very funny. People like to spin stories. It says here, they had brought respect in learned circles. Their multiple books on the subject ranged from the strictly scholarly, a translation of the 4 Gospels from the Syriac of the Sinai palimpsest, to the more talkly and popular How the Codex Was Found. Somehow the rumor spread that Mrs. Lewis had just happened to recognize a fragment of the ancient manuscript in the monastery dining hall where it was being used as a butter dish. It's not true, by the way, that was a rumor. People spread all kinds of crazy rumors. But what's interesting is these 2 women, and one of the sisters anyways, just randomly is walking down the hallway one day and she bumps into this interesting scholar who's going to play an integral part of getting hold of these items out of the Cairo Geniza. Now I'm going to try and jump to where they find this man, it's kind of an interesting, he's very important, by the way. His last name is Schechter, Solomon Schechter. Very important meeting of these people. It says, while out strolling in downtown Cambridge, she was especially glad to bump into a good friend and, strangely, another twin who also took great pride in his beautiful hands, the Romanian-born Talmud scholar Solomon Schechter. What's interesting is this man will play an integral part in the excitement that will be generated regarding the finds at this Geniza. And even more of an oddball in the Donish context of Cambridge than Agnes and Margaret, the very Jewish, very blustery Schechter must too have made a remarkable figure as he strode down the king's parade. With his bushy, red-tinted beard, unruly hair, and a tendency to gesticulate broadly as he spoke, Schechter had been known to set off into broiling heat of the midsummer wrapped up in a winter coat and several yards of scarf. He's an interesting fellow. And the acquaintance remembered the first meeting with Schechter and his dirty black coat, smudged all over with snuff and ashes from his cigar, hands unwashed, nails as black as ink, but rather nice fingers, beard and hair, unkempt, ruddy complexion, and one ear that was stuffed full of wool. What a sexy man. That's really... Now, the two sisters managed to get into Solomon Schechter's hands at least a fragment. And I don't want to go into the details. I just want to give you the kind of the nutshell of it. They managed to get into his hand a fragment, a piece of vellum. And what happens afterwards is very interesting. He sends a letter to them, to the sisters. Fragment, very important. Come to me this afternoon. And what was so interesting is they have a copy of the letter. And he says, please don't tell anybody about this. You mustn't tell anybody. The letter reads like this: Dear Mrs. Lewis, I think we have reason to congratulate ourselves. For the fragment I took with me represents a piece of the original Hebrew of Ecclesiasticus. It is the first time that such a thing was discovered. Please do not speak yet about this matter until tomorrow. I will come to you tomorrow. He was so hurried, by the way, he confused p.m. He meant to say a.m. About 11 p.m. to talk over the matter with you of how to make the matter known. In haste and great excitement, yours sincerely, S. Schechter. Anyway, as the story goes on, he will be the one finally to be able to at least peek up there and get a glance at what's in this upper room. And then he's told basically he has to leave. Somewhat interesting. The authors do a little nice piece here. They say Geniza is barely a translatable Hebrew term that holds within it an ultimate statement about the worth of words and their place in Jewish life. It derives from the Persian kanj, or kanj meaning hoard or hidden treasure. And while the expression itself does not appear in the Bible, several of the later biblical books composed under Persian rule contain a handful of related inflections. Esther and Ezra, for instance, speak of the Ginzei Hamelech or Ginzei Malak Malka, the king's treasuries, and the royal archives. Rabbinic usage of the root is more common, if also more peculiar. In the Talmud, it is almost always suggested the notion of concealment or storing away. Just like what is entailed is not specific, it's not quite sure. But what's interesting is this carries the connotation, by the way, for the most part, most people believe, of to conceal with the intent to bury. So, interesting. Anyway, as I'd like to just kind of give you a glimpse of what this synagogue, and I believe this is restored, but push in a little bit so you can see. You get a good idea of what we're looking at in terms of a structure. It wasn't some rickety old yucky building, but the upper room, by the way, was. So as I began to get interested in this, the story became riveting to me of how this became a fight for who would have access. And it is this man, Schechter, who indeed, I believe, he's allowed to transport more than 140,000 pieces from the Geniza back to Cambridge. But he wasn't the only one. There was a race against time, and some people tried to come and buy these things and acquire them, and a whole host of people came out. So when you hear about people referring to pieces that have come out of the Cairo Geniza, they have an interesting past. Many people have fought to acquire them. Most of the pieces coming out of the Geniza are fragments. They're small, and if they are larger pieces, they are usually not large, full intact biblical pieces. Now, the history of this and the rest of the story, as they say, is history, as the bulk of these pieces are beginning to be taken by universities, and we'll say at least 3 major universities take hold of these, and the process of translating and looking at something incredible happens that could not happen with the Dead Sea Scrolls. You see, the Dead Sea Scrolls only gave a glimpse into a limited culture in a limited area, even though they were Jews. It was a limited culture in a limited area. The fragments and everything collected from the Geniza represented a much larger territory, a much broader concept of daily life and existence for a fuller period of time than the one point in time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, one of these scholars in here labels anything that came out of the Geniza, if the Dead Sea Scrolls are indeed the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are the living scrolls that came out of the Geniza. So, my mind twirling about, wow, wouldn't it be fabulous if we could really reach into history with all of our collecting and the pieces that we've acquired over time to really have something that would date back in history. Although most of you who've seen the Bible collection that we have, we've got fragments, we have Torahs from different parts of the world, we've got many things, but nothing of this nature, of this magnitude, and certainly of this age has been in our possession. We've never had anything from the Geniza and anything that dates to this period in history like this. So it was amazing to me that these pieces, like many different things, became available. And again, it's one of those moments where you say, I'm not sure how we're going to do this. But from the history book that I'm reading to you, which is a great story told by 2 really wonderful writers, and I don't sell books, and I'm not selling this one, from this to the library at Cambridge, into a private collection, and now into the Scott collection, I have sitting on the floor to my right 2 pieces that have come out of the Cairo Geniza. So what you see here, if I will tap the corner of this piece right here, what you see here is a complete leaf, and very interesting because it resembles greatly something that looks like the Aleppo Codex type pages I previously had showed you. What we have here is something that dates somewhere, and the dating is difficult because we already see that there are vowel points, and the type of ink on vellum that was used here is a leaf from Amos, from the prophet Amos. We have a beautiful leaf in great condition. There's a little bit of wearing around the edges, and that's normal for something of this age, which probably dates to somewhere maybe right just before 1000 AD in terms of dating it. And then the piece that is on the other side is slightly older. It has been, it's had probably some transport issues, and it's been through a lot. So what you're looking at, this fragment over here, is from Exodus. It is one of the larger pieces out of this collection. And this one, again, it would be somewhere between the mid-900s in its dating. You can see that the vellum, the difference between the writing, the coloration, there's many things that, again, I will probably go out in depth and pick apart and study and come up with my own write-up for these so that when we do show them at some point, we can at least have a clear identification of their age, which we're able to do through many other processes. But these 2 pieces came out of the Cairo Geniza, and they are in our possession for the Bible collection. So, I think, you know, some of you have seen some of the things that I've added to the collection. When I've told people, Dr. Scott started a brilliant work, and the genius of his collecting was to find, as a collector who collected just about everything, I think he once said he collected everything except for women. But as a collector, he did such a great job as a collector would in collecting first and second and third editions. And when we had all of the manuscripts exhibited, what became clear to me as I looked, as I love history, I absolutely love the telling of, it's better than any novel you could write or you could fabricate, because it's riveting. But what I had concluded was that there was so much within each phase of Bible development and study that to see everything at one time was almost, it was an ocular and mental assault on how to absorb and process all of this. So I set out to start filling in some of those areas that, for example, we did not possess a Wycliffe Bible. Dr. Scott had amassed many things, but that was something missing in the collection. So when that came in our path, I said, I just don't know how we're going to do this, but we're going to do it because we must have this. And so we acquired it. And through time and through that is only God bringing these things at the right time, where you say, wow, we don't have any money, but that's okay. The Lord will make a way, and the Lord has always made a way. He brings things to the doorstep really at the worst possible time, and then you have to make a leap of faith and trust that God will provide. He does. But some of you I know who've been around and you say, well, you're still collecting. Yes, I've probably doubled the collection, filled in many of what I call the missing pieces, built up some of the areas that I felt were lacking. And more importantly, there is a goal in sight. It isn't just, well, like we had these things here. There's a goal in sight. And that, for the people who really want to know, you're just going to have to hang around long enough to find out. But in the meantime, it is pieces like this that people will spend a lifetime as collectors pursuing. And the fact that there are such large pieces in terms of where they came from, considering, by the way, if you consider the fact that from the hands of these two women on through this man, on through many other hands, that this would come into our hands, it's really quite remarkable. So there's a great history there. And for those people who are just listening and saying, well, I don't understand, well, what does that have to do with other things? This ministry, I think I've just finished saying to you about the book of Jeremiah, teaching and bringing the word. We don't need to import ideas of the world, but preserving the history, preserving the interest, preserving the ideas that through time God has preserved. He's managed to put these things into people's hands, that they were kept and that they were preserved and perpetuated. And I think for the ones who really get what this ministry is about, you understand that's at the background of a lot of the driving force to continue to perpetuate and herald God's word. Now, we can never forget the history. We can never start saying, oh, we take this for granted. We don't worship the book. We don't worship the papyri. But that is a huge piece of history, like the Wycliffe Bible. You know, we can talk about the history of the Bible, and we can talk about how the English Bible came to us. But actually seeing that Bible, and some of you who helped put it on display, just holding something that's that old, that is that original, that authentic, that somebody died, not somebody, many people died, probably clutching to that Bible that was probably taken out of their hands and put somewhere else and is now in our hands. That's staggering. That's part of our history. That's why I say when people say, well, why history? Why history? History matters. Now, there's so many other places in history that we could camp off and talk a little bit, but the focus right now is showing you what we've acquired and ultimately putting together the possibility to show these things in a fashion where, without it being overwhelming, people eventually will be able once again to see And I think done in such a fashion where people can not only see, but walk along and learn in a fashion that you're not overwhelmed with so many things simultaneously. And that really was the key for me. When I saw the Bible collection, we changed it. We modified it. We simplified it. We began more to tell the story and the background. And I think when people really get to see some of these stories behind the book, not just the telling of history, the stories behind the book. That's why this book I just read from fascinates me, because these two women, such unlikely candidates, and this Jewish scholar, another very unlikely candidate, and there's a whole host of characters that bring this to life with such vigor that when you read it, you're not only captivated by the historical document, but by the history that was created along the way. And that's part of the journey of learning and appreciating these precious treasures. So I share with you tonight from the Cairo Geniza, and I hope that eventually be able to show them to you. You'll be able to get a close-up look, but at least you got a first look tonight.
When I get up in the morning.
You are watching the University Network. The phone number to call is 1-800-338-3030. That's 1-800-338-3030.